Okay, Toda Meir, Toda Livnot. This evening, we shall talk about stairways to heaven. To heaven. Okay, so first of all, let's share the screen. Okay, and
looks good.
There we go, looking good. So, we're going to talk about stairways, and the stairs you see on the bottom right that were found near Tzipori, do they actually lead to Jerusalem, or are they just somebody was practicing their chiseling physique over there? And we'll see what the possibilities are. So let's start with a Livnot tradition. Livnot programs offer a 3-day hike on the longer programs. This has been a Livnot tradition, of course, for decades. Many alumni in recent virtual reunions have mentioned this pilgrimage to the sea as one of their most memorable highlights. Livnot groups during the 3-day hike have ranged from 15 people to 60. You really get to know people on this hike. There's time for some good heart-to-heart conversations. There are people who are always there to help or never there. And there are people who can entertain at night with great stories, music around the campfire, and sometimes you get to know who snores too. TMI. People have often called the 3-day hike an experience of community without walls. It's really a microcosm of life, just with more sweat, more blisters, and more chafing. But in the end, you get to that sunset and the sea, and it was all worth it. Now imagine for a moment that you're doing a 3-day hike, not with your Livnot group, but your entire village. You're walking from, let's say, your Galilee village with your entire community to the temple in Jerusalem a few thousand years ago. 3 times a year, most able-bodied people would go up to the temple in Jerusalem. It's what Jews did. But you wouldn't go up alone, and you wouldn't go up with just your family. You would go up to Jerusalem with the entire community. It would be an intense bonding experience. And today we'll be discussing those 2 important Jewish values, community and Jerusalem. They are connected. This is just one of the great communal traditions that we've lost over the years. Not that people don't go up to Jerusalem anymore, of course they do. But entire communities used to make the pilgrimage together. It was a thing. I personally would have loved to do it at least once. Imagine doing the 3-day hike again, but with your entire community, not just 30 of your chevre. And not just to get to the sea, to have a moment and then get back to Livnot and have pizza and sleep it off after a shower or 2. But to get to Jerusalem, to the temple, to the city, and the building that are not just a city and a building, but a symbol of unity, oneness, spirituality. Now, of course, the trek wouldn't just be a walk in the park. There'd be easy and difficult parts, both physically and socially. There will be those who always are there to help, and there'll be those who are always there to complain. That's community. It stopped happening suddenly about 1950 years ago, when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed and we lost our independence. Now, it's not the end of the world. Judaism still exists without the temple and without the pilgrimage to the temple. But it's fascinating to learn about how people did it, what an impact it had on the various Jewish communities, and how people look forward to it 3 times a year. We know that this happened from the Jewish sources, some biblical, and most Talmudic. A few years ago, a father and son archaeological team decided that they had found physical evidence. How can you have physical evidence of people walking 2,000 years ago? Yigal and Yotam Teper took a long, hard, out-of-the-box look at a phenomenon found almost only in Israel, almost always near ancient pathways, almost always near Jewish villages, and especially surrounding Jerusalem. Ancient chiseled stone steps, like the ones you see that they're sitting on right here. After researching, measuring, comparing, and compiling data for years, they came to some amazing conclusions. Their theory is that many of these chiseled steps were connected to special dedicated Jewish pilgrimage pathways that communities used in order to ascend to Jerusalem. It's still a bit controversial. Some archaeologists and historians think they need to compile even more data to make acceptable conclusions, but most agree that they're on to something. In modern times, the more we dig and the more we use technology, the more we learn about the past and the more we change our minds about how that past was lived out. And of course, there's that old joke that the archaeologists always tell. What happens now has just happened and it's unchangeable. What happens in the future we don't know about and we can't change. And the only thing that is constantly changing is the past. If you didn't laugh, don't worry, just don't become an archaeologist. For years, guides have been telling their flocks, myself included, that these chiseled steps, not far from Jerusalem, are part of the imperial Roman road system that crisscrossed Israel thousands of years ago. The Teppers came and said, can't be. Now, there were many types of ancient roads in the land of Israel, and some can still be seen today. Among them are public roads, agricultural roads between villages and fields, rural roads between villages and springs. There were Canaanite roads, Israelite roads, Roman imperial roads, Crusader roads, Mamluk roads, British roads, and of course, today's Israeli roads. In general, when a government builds a highway, it's done in a uniform way, but this was especially true during the Roman period. Roman imperial roads had to meet international Roman standards, which were uniform throughout the empire. To be specific, Roman roads were of a certain width. This is one that is found near the coast, with specific layers of dirt and gravel and stones underneath the paved stones that are above, and there's always milestones. This is a group of 11 milestones that are found together, and you would ask, isn't one milestone enough? But each one had an inscription that was dedicated to the Caesar, the Great, the Amazing, the Imperator, the Emperor, the All-Holy, the winner of this and the winner of that. And so when there was a change in the government, they simply knocked down the old one and put up a new one. So you will find them usually in the same area, and here they've kind of brought them back together. The first such imperial milestone was erected in the year 69 CE, about a year before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed on the road from Caesarea to Bet-Shan. But the chiseled steps, the Teppers believe, were put there by Jewish communities long before the temple was destroyed, because they were used for making the pilgrimage to the temple. This is a map of almost all the roads that they found in Israel. They found close to over 60 of these roads. And the arrow points to Tzipori, which we'll be talking about in a moment. Now, these chiseled steps are not all uniform in size, and this is perhaps because it wasn't a central government that was doing the chiseling, it was a local Jewish community. So this is one of the most famous roads in the world. It's the first official Roman road known as the Appian Way, Via Appia, named for its founder, Roman official named Appius, and it was constructed in the early 4th century. Now look at it, it's doing pretty well. It was the first long road built specifically to transport Roman troops from Rome to all points elsewhere. The roads began in Rome, where a list of destinations and roads were located, hence the expression, of course, all roads lead to Rome. But the Romans had become masters of road construction not in the 4th century. They'd done it centuries before. They were able to build a road, for instance, that crossed the Alps without having to chisel one step. They simply made serpentine roads that did not try to go straight up the mountain, but by slow, gradual ascent, and they could take carriages that, for instance, on steps would have a problem. And the Roman road tradition started way before in places like Israel. We can find Roman roads today all over the country, but the Roman roads, as we said, almost never had steps. And steps, according to the Teppers, was a specifically Jewish phenomenon. They were not standalone steps. They were part of something bigger, much, much bigger. Here's a map that we've been using almost every week when talking about the Lower Galilee. And here's Tzipori right in the middle. And next to Tzipori, the Teppers found 2 chiseled steps. Here's one that was found near a hill called Mount Chia, named for a famous rabbi who lived there a while ago. This is a hill that's very, very close to Tzipori, and it has 7 chiseled steps, each step being about 2.1 meters wide. This section was identified by an expert years ago as being part of the ancient Roman road from Akko to Tzipori. But it's important to note the chiseled steps are only half of the width of the standard imperial Roman road. This is the other ascent, named by the Teppers the Tzipori ascent, or Ma'alet Tzipori, and it's right above the ancient Roman road from Tzipori to Megiddo. This ascent has 8 steps, and they're narrower than the ones in the previous picture from Mount Chia. If one follows this road to the south, there are even more chiseled steps. Here's Tzipori in the background, and you can see that these steps are about 1 kilometer and a little bit from the city, pretty close, and so are the others. Now, the Teppers, originally from Kibbutz Yagur, not far from there, wrote a book in 2013 that describes in detail all the ancient rock-hewn steps that they have found in Israel. And they came up with a very brave proposal. These were special ritual roads that served local Jewish communities as they began and continued to ascend to Jerusalem. Their fresh new look at Jewish pilgrimage roads has changed the way we today understand the idea of Aliyah Laregel, or ascent to Jerusalem and the temple by foot. But the question, of course, is to be asked, what is the significance of chiseled roads, chiseled steps along the pilgrimage road? In many cultures and religions, steps were used to climb up to high holy places. And this was true way before Hashem invented Jews. Judaism, on the whole, does not ascribe holiness to topographically high places. This was actually more of a Canaanite, pagan practice. Many believe that Moses' blessing of Benjamin, that he would dwell between the shoulders, is actually a topographical description of Jerusalem. When you're in the old city, take a look around, especially when you're in the city of David, and you'll see that you are surrounded on all sides by higher hills. There are those who in English even call this area the Holy Basin, because above it are hills. So you can see Mount Scopus on the left and Mount Olives on the right, the same range there, which towers above Jerusalem. And then we have Mount Sinai. Many people think it's the highest hill in the desert, but actually, according to the Midrash, it was a low, humble mountain. And it wasn't like an Everest. The idea wasn't for Moses to try to do some climbing contest, and higher is cooler or higher is more spiritual. But rather, the idea was that the mountain should fit the Torah. And the Torah fits people who learn it in humility. And the arrogant might find the Torah a little too challenging. But Judaism did emphasize the climbing to spiritual heights. Therefore, in Hebrew, one goes up to Jerusalem. Israelis say this today without even thinking about it. And even if I'm on a mountain north or south of Jerusalem that's much higher than the highest point in Jerusalem, I'm still going up to Jerusalem. And let's not forget other ideas with the same theme. Jacob's ladder, steps leading up to the temple, steps leading up to the Bima and the Torah ark in the synagogue today, getting an aliyah to the Torah, going on aliyah to Israel. It's all over our language and our culture. If there are steps, they're not there to make you topographically higher, but to symbolize getting spiritually higher. And Hebrew takes us one step further. Today, the modern Hebrew word for step is madrega. But in ancient Israel, madrega meant something else, an agricultural terrace made of stone. Here's one right outside of Jerusalem. It's beautiful. You can see why they would be called steps, but the word madrega was really the word for these kinds of steps, big, huge agricultural steps. The ancient Hebrew biblical word for step is ma'aleh. Okay, ma'aleh, this should be an E instead of an A. Perhaps you notice that the word ma'aleh and aliyah have the same Hebrew root word. An ascent or a step is a ma'aleh. Steps or ascents, plural, would be ma'alot. So this is a ma'aleh. It's an ascent, and it has steps. A road that climbs from Jericho to Jerusalem and goes by red color rocks will be called Ma'aleh Adumim, the red ascent. And here's the city with the same name. So this, by the way, is the ancient Ma'aleh Adumim with steps that, according to the Teppers, was for people who were ascending near where today is the modern Ma'aleh Adumim. So going up to Jerusalem and climbing steps to do it, it's not only the same idea. In Hebrew, it's the same word. Concerning chiseled steps, the Teppers believe that a few of these steps were local and not connected to the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but just a few. However, the vast majority of the chiseled steps, in their opinion, were made by local villagers for the mitzvah of going up to Jerusalem for the three big yearly festivals, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. These were not functional steps. You didn't need them. They didn't help you. They were ceremonial steps, ritual steps to help celebrate the community's ascent by foot to Jerusalem together. When the pilgrims reached Jerusalem, most would enter the Temple Mount from the south, from this direction, by using some very unusual steps that led up to these two pairs of gates here known as Huldah gates. Huldah was a prophetess living at the end of the first temple period, around the same time as Jeremiah. These specific steps are from after that time period, but some believe they got their name from Huldah's practice of sitting right there. Huldah was also the ancient term for an animal called a mole. Some would say weasel. And some think that the gates got their name from the underground tunnel that led here to the Temple Mount, and is still there today. Now, please look at the uneven nature of these steps. If you ascend from here, then you have 3 steps that are short, then you have a long step, 2 short steps, a long step, short, long, short, long. It's balagan. You can't just walk up the steps. Look at them here. There's 2, and then there's 1, there's 2. And it's very confusing. These are the old ones, and they put above it, you can see new ones in the exact same place. But someone who chiseled this did not do it just because they wanted to have fun. There was a reason for it. Now, you can't just walk up to the temple as if you're going to the shuk. This is a special building. It's a place that is full of uniqueness, and it demands intention, and it demands focus. The Olympic torchbearer would never be able to ascend these steps with his head held high, eyes glancing straight, like you can see here. Now look at the pink steps here are all the same size steps. But if this person was climbing up to the temple, they would definitely fall. They would have to look down and focus because you have to concentrate. It almost forces you to think about each stride and its significance. Where are you going? Why are you going? For the past few days, you've been putting one foot in front of the other. But every time you saw steps, you had to stop for a moment and focus. King David wrote in his poetry in the book of Psalms, "In the house of Hashem, we will walk with emotion." The same Hebrew word used for that could also mean trembling. In the temple, we walk trembling. We walk in awe, in radical amazement. Some commentators on this verse wrote, "One should not enter the temple walking upright and tall. One should enter in a state of awe and trembling by looking down at the steps. One gets to into the temple mode. Sometimes simple architecture can lead to a very special ambiance." As we'd mentioned, most of these chiseled step portions of the road have no functional purpose whatsoever, and they're in places that could easily be traversed by simply taking another path or going right around them. This caught the eye of the Teppers, and they believe it is a key factor in marking these paths as ceremonial and not functional. What is true for the steps right up to the temple in macro might have been true for the pilgrimage road to the temple in micro. Steps, especially ceremonial steps, demand your attention. But there's another angle that should be mentioned here that deals with the tradition not enacted today in Judaism as it was in the past. And I'm referring to ritual purity. For instance, the mikveh that we see here. This was something that was much more part of Jewish life in Israel in ancient times, especially at the time of the temple, than it is today. All the Kohanim, the priests, and some others who took upon themselves this practice made sure that they were in a state of ritual purity, but especially on the way to the temple. No one, no human, is allowed to enter the Temple Mount area without being in a state of tahara, ritual purity. And this was done by going to the mikveh, by not being in contact with a dead person or a carcass, a ritually impure person. That's why in some of these mikvot, like this one, the people going in walk down one, and there's a wall there separating the two, because when you come back out the other way, you don't want to be physically in contact with someone who is not yet in the state of ritual purity. The Teppers found that many of the chiseled step ascents were near water sources, and many were near mikvahs. Add to this the ancient tradition that the land of Israel itself is in a state of ritual purity, unless one was walking through an area that had an overwhelming pagan majority. One of the roads goes through Samaria, and Samaria had Samaritans who were pagans. Those walking in an area that was mainly pagan lost their status of ritual purity. However, if they were walking through that area on a dedicated Jewish road, they kept their status of ritual purity. Some scholars believe that the source of this rule is the pagan practice to bury their dead all over the place, and not specifically in a collective cemetery or graveyard. So someone walking in such a pagan majority area would not know if they were ritually pure or not. So by having a special road that was specifically prepared and chiseled by the Jewish community, all the community could use it, including Kohanim and those who had strict ritual purity standards, without the fear of becoming ritually impure. In this case, we can see it was actually an inclusive act for those who had stricter traditions. It's kind of like a Jewish community event that would be had with kosher food, like we used to have in Kansas City, where I grew up. Most of the people, the vast majority, did not keep kosher, but there were a few folks who did. And so Jewish communal events would often have kosher food in order for all the members of the community to be able to eat together. So this was another reason why these roads could be helpful specifically in the framework of a community. The Teppers believe that in the future, technology will help prove their theory correct. But even now, while it's just a theory, The idea is fascinating. Jewish communities physically marking sections of their own pilgrimage paths. I'd like to imagine, just for a moment, yourself being part of your community that decides to do, let's say, a 3-day ascent to Jerusalem from your village in the north. When the day and the hour arrives, you gather together in the village square. Speeches are made, blessings are given. Those that cannot join the pilgrimage for whatever reason are there to feel part of the communal effort. And then perhaps a sending off, here we go ceremony with some song and dance, and the great walk begins. After a few hundred meters of walking on the traditional path that's been used for centuries to ascend from that community to Jerusalem for this very purpose, the leaders arrive at the local community hewn steps. Perhaps here, songs were sung. Maybe. That's hard to know. Perhaps like the very songs of ascent that were sung by the Levites on the steps of the temple courtyard. There were 15 of those steps, 15 songs for 15 steps. While they were standing on the steps that led to the temple itself, they would sing these songs. Shir HaMa'alot, a song of ascents, but it was also a song of steps. So communities would go in caravans with musical instruments, playing music and singing, and would create their own rituals of pilgrimage. The entire road would be a special road that was sanctified for this very purpose. And once a year, as the Mishnah tells us, appointed people would go and prepare the roads for mass transit, making sure the water supply was ready and potable, and that the mikvahs were full and ready too. Every so often, the ascenders would be reminded that they're on a dedicated and ritually pure road as they reached other sections of the road that featured chiseled steps. As one came nearer and nearer to Jerusalem, more and more chiseled steps would be traversed, and one can imagine the excitement of, Mom, are we there yet? With the rest of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And the truth is, part of this experience is indeed mentioned in the Mishnah when describing the pilgrimage that people would take in order to bring their first fruits to the temple in Jerusalem. This would most likely happen on the holiday of Sukkot, but not only. And here's a picture, a painting someone did of people bringing the first fruits. You can see that people have baskets with fruit. And let's read the Mishnah, which gives a very colorful description. All the people of the cities would assemble in the main city, and they would spend the night in the open street, and they would not enter any of the houses. Early in the morning, the leader would say, let us arise and go up to Zion, to the house of Hashem. Those who lived near Jerusalem would bring fresh figs and grapes, while those who lived far away would bring dried figs and raisins. An ox would go in front of them, horns covered in gold, and with a crown of olive leaves on its head. The flute would play before them until they would come close to Jerusalem. When they came close to Jerusalem, they would send messengers in advance, and they would adorn their first fruits. The heads of the temple would go out to greet them. They would be greeted with the following words. Our brothers, people from such and such a place, we welcome you in peace. The flute would play before them until they reached the Temple Mount. This colorful description gives an idea of the pomp and circumstance that accompanied the pilgrimage, which was communal in nature. And this is what made the pilgrimages so special. They were not 3-day hikes that people did alone or with their best friends or with their chevra. It was the entire community. Some would even say what makes something holy is not that a special person is doing it, but that an entire community is doing it. In Judaism, community has the potential to bring about holiness. And this is a radical departure from understanding. And if some of the community members can't make it, then they appoint others, even symbolically, to go in their place. Since many of the chisel steps were outside the villages themselves, perhaps even those not able to make the long trek could have walked until the steps, like in Sipori, and ascended them as if they were ascending the steps to the temple. Perhaps one day we'll know more of the details of this tradition, but it used to be a big part of being Jewish in the land of Israel in temple times. Here are 2 examples of the Shir HaMa'alot series of 15 songs of ascent songs of steps. Try to connect them in your mind with the tradition of communal pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Song of Ascents of David. I rejoiced when they said to me, let's go to the house of Hashem. Our feet stood inside your gates, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the built-up city that is connected together. It was to there that the tribes would make the pilgrimage. The tribes of Hashem made evident to Israel to praise the name of Hashem. There the seats of judgment were, the seats of the house of David. Pray for the shalom of Jerusalem. May those who love you find serenity. May there be shalom within your walls, serenity within your castles. For the sake of my brothers and sisters and friends, I will speak up so that you will have shalom. For the sake of the house of Hashem, I will ask that you have goodness. There's oneness and there's community and there's Jerusalem in that psalm. And of course, there's the very famous Hinei Matovu Manaim, a song of ascent of David. How good and pleasant it is that brothers and sisters sit together. And we could add walk together too, even snore together. After a few hours or a few days, the entire community would reach the southern kotel, and after ritually purifying themselves in a mikveh, and there's scores and scores of them right there that can be seen today in the place called the Ofel, they would finish the pilgrimage with another symbolic ascent to the Hulda gates. These steps would not only mark the end of their long journey to the temple, they would mark something else. After walking joyously with the entire community and meeting others who were also on their way to Jerusalem, they would also have to concentrate on an individual level and prepare themselves spiritually to reach a place of great holiness and great awe and great radical amazement. Today, when people hear the words Temple Mount, especially in the news, those words are often understood in a political context. The phenomenon of the chiseled step roads that we can see today all over the country can transport us back to a time when the temple and the act of ascending to it with one's community was understood in a pure context, the context of becoming one. One with one's own self, one's community, one's people, and one's creator. Did these steps near Tzipori lead all the way to the temple in Jerusalem? It might very well be. We can't yet prove it, but there's a good chance. What it does do is remind us of a long-lost Jewish tradition, and it connects communities, no matter where they are, to Jerusalem. Hopefully, in the years to come, more and more will be learned about the connection between these steps and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Some of the Tepper's theories may be proven right or wrong, but they definitely deserve credit for bringing this phenomenon to the public and for recording every single set of chiseled stairs that they and others had ever found in Israel. So the two Jewish values that we mentioned here, community and Jerusalem. One last note. If one looks at traditional Jewish prayer, much of it is written in the plural, in a community setting. This is a group of Ethiopian Jews that are making an ascent within Ethiopia to a hill as if it were Jerusalem, because they couldn't make it the entire way. And this is back in 1955. And today there's a special day when the community and many others ascend to Jerusalem. So the classic example of plural prayer, communal prayer, is the final prayer said in most synagogues at the end of almost every service, and it's called the Aleinu. And Aleinu means it's incumbent upon us, not me, us. Most prayers are read in the plural. Only a few, like the first prayer of the day that's said upon waking up when you open your eyes, Modeh Ani, thankful am I, those are in the singular. And this is, but of course, most of them being in the plural is due to Judaism being based more on community than it is on the individual. Prayers, as it were meant to be said in the context of community. And so it is with many Jewish traditions. For instance, fasting when there is a drought from the lack of rain, mourning for someone who has died, having a wedding and a festive meal, and the list goes on of things that are done traditionally in a communal setting. The basic Jewish unit for celebrating publicly is the community. But Davka today, in the wake of the current pandemic, many of us are learning the hard way, the importance and the beauty of this great Jewish value of the community, because it's been taken away from us. The chiseled stairs that one can see when hiking the land of Israel is a reminder of this great idea of which we can be proud. As Hillel said, don't separate yourself from the community. Or as was said after the story of Honi, the stone roller, who died a lonely man, give me chavruta, or give me death. May the days of chavruta and communal celebrations soon return to our people and the entire world. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a good week, stays healthy and happy and cool. Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Michael. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.